They didn't say his name, not at birthdays, not at holidays, not even in whispered conversations behind closed doors. Dylan had vanished from the Rosner family not because he died, but because he lived honestly. The day his grandfather discovered that Dylan was gay, the boy they once called a prodigy became a shame no one spoke of. From that moment on, silence was louder than words. Photos disappeared from the hallway. His piano in the living room was sold. His name wasn't even mentioned in the prayer circle during Thanksgiving. It was as if Dylan had never existed. But he had. He existed in every memory April carried in her chest. The cousin who used to walk her to the bus stop, who taught her how to braid friendship bracelets, who held her hand when her parents were fighting. For her, Dylan was never a ghost. He was the one constant when everything else fell apart. Still, years passed. Dylan moved away quietly, working night shifts at a small hotel in Virginia. He didn't protest, didn't argue, didn't beg to be let back in. He learned to live with absence. He taught himself how to pour champagne without shaking hands. He mastered the art of folding napkins like swans. And he became invisible by profession, just as his family had made him invisible by blood. Until one morning, his manager handed him a schedule change. Someone from banquet staff had fallen ill, and Dylan was needed to cover a wedding. Nothing unusual until he saw the name on the booking sheet. April Rosner, his cousin, the girl who used to fall asleep beside him on stormy nights because thunder made her cry. He stared at the paper for a long time. She hadn't contacted him in years. He hadn't received an invitation. Not a text, not a card, just a name on a shift schedule. Dylan folded the paper in half, tucked it into his pocket, and whispered to no one, "Guess I'm going to the wedding after all." At the venue, he dressed in the uniform black slacks, white shirt, name tag clipped to the breast pocket. He tied his apron slowly, watching his reflection in the restroom mirror. For a moment, he imagined her face again, wondered if she still wore her hair in braids, wondered if she would recognize him at all. But recognition wasn't why he came. He didn't come to be seen. He came to see her happy. That was enough. He told himself that. The ballroom shimmered with gold trim and rose-colored light. Guests arrived in polished shoes and silk gowns, clinking glasses of Prosecco and laughing beneath chandeliers. Dylan walked among them like a ghost, silent, efficient, nameless. No one noticed. No one stopped. The Rosners mingled in elegant suits. The older generation already tipsy on legacy and wine. His mother was there, his uncle, even his grandfather, older now, hunched over a cane. Not a single one turned toward him. Not one of them saw the boy they had erased. But April had not yet arrived. And Dylan, though he said nothing, wanted it for her. He had learned long ago that some reunions don't begin with invitations. They begin with courage. If stories of quiet strength, hidden pain, and unexpected redemption move you, don't forget to follow Heartstories for more real, powerful tales like this. Your support helps bring these voices into the light. As the music swelled and guests found their seats, Dylan kept moving, one tray at a time. He weaved through the crowd like he belonged to no one, his eyes careful not to linger too long, his hands steady even when his heart wasn't. The job was simple: refill the glasses, clear the tables, smile when appropriate, vanish when not. And yet, every corner of the room was a reminder. The faces, the voices, the gestures, pieces of a family he once thought would always include him. When his mother passed by, Dylan instinctively stepped back into the shadows behind the floral arch. She laughed at something the woman beside her said. Her hair was grayer now, the lines around her mouth deeper, but the cold sharpness in her eyes hadn't aged a day. She had been the first to flinch when he came out, the first to say nothing when others spoke for her. Her silence, in the end, had hurt more than anyone's words. Then came the uncle who used to throw Dylan up in the air when he was little, who once told him he'd make a fine man someday. Now, that same uncle walked by and praised April's fiancé, calling him a real man for wearing the family ring. Dylan watched it all with the detachment of someone who had long ago stopped expecting anything. He didn't resent them anymore. He had simply stopped bleeding where they'd once cut. Still, something cracked when he saw the piano. It stood in a quiet corner of the ballroom, rented, polished, untouched. For a second, he wondered if April had chosen it. The sight of it, identical to the one they sold years ago, made Dylan freeze. That piano had once been his world. It had filled the house with music when no one else could. He used to play lullabies for April during sleepovers, their feet dangling from the bench, their laughter rising with each wrong note. To see it there, now like a ghost from another life, was almost too much. But he looked away, carried the next tray, and reminded himself this wasn't his wedding. This wasn't even his family. Not anymore, Dawn. In the kitchen, Dylan stood near the swinging door, waiting for the next cue. That's when a voice called out behind him. Dylan Rosner. He turned slowly. A young man stood there, phone in hand, disbelief spreading across his face. Dylan recognized him instantly. Micah. April's childhood friend. One of the few kids who used to visit them both in the summer, back when the house still echoed with laughter. Micah was taller now, sharper in his features, but his voice was the same. I thought Micah began, then paused. I thought you weren't invited. I wasn't, Dylan replied softly, his eyes scanning the hallway, then resting back on Micah's. I'm working. Micah frowned. Does she know you're here? Dylan shrugged. Does it matter? But Micah didn't answer. He looked at Dylan as if trying to put together a puzzle he didn't know was missing a piece. Then, without warning, he raised his phone. I'm filming behind the scenes for April's wedding vlog, he said, his voice a mix of curiosity and hesitation. This is a story. Please don't, Dylan said, holding up a hand. Not now. Micah lowered the phone. I won't, but you should know. April's not okay. There's been fighting. Her dad's been pushing prenup documents. She locked herself in the dressing room earlier. Dylan's heart dropped. He had feared as much. April's father had always been controlling, demanding respect without ever earning it, forcing decisions under the guise of tradition. If he had even a fraction of the authority over this wedding that he once had over her childhood. Dylan knew she must be struggling, but it wasn't his place to interfere. He had no place. He returned to the ballroom just as the music shifted the signal that the bride was about to make her entrance. The guests rose. The groom adjusted his tie, and somewhere behind the heavy double doors, April was supposed to appear on her father's arm, but she didn't. The music looped once, then again. The guests murmured. The wedding planner whispered into her headset. The groom's expression shifted from expectation to confusion. And then the doors burst open, not with a grand entrance, but with footsteps full of purpose. April stood alone, veil lifted, bouquet trembling in her hands. She was breathless and furious. Her eyes scanned the room. Then they locked on Dylan. In the stillness of that moment, everything froze. And then, without hesitation, she spoke. Dylan, she called, voice strong. If you still love me like you did when we were little, I need you to walk me down that aisle. Gasps followed. The Rosners turned, faces turning pale. Some in the crowd whispered. Others stared in shock. But Dylan didn't move. Not yet. His heart thundered. His hands were still. Until April took one step forward and smiled through her tears. And Dylan realized this wedding wasn't just hers. It was his, too. At first, Dylan didn't move. The tray in his hands felt like stone. Around him, the world spun, slowly gasps layered over whispers, the murmur of confusion swelling into disbelief. A server wasn't supposed to step into the spotlight. A disowned boy wasn't meant to stand in for a father. Yet there she was, April standing at the threshold in her wedding dress, calling for him in front of everyone they both had once called family. He looked at her. The April he remembered was a girl who scraped her knees chasing fireflies, who collected broken crayons like treasures, who once told him, in the quiet of a thunderstorm, that she hoped when she grew up, she'd be brave like him. And now here she stood, trembling but unyielding, inviting him to be part of her courage. His heart cracked open. He placed the tray on the nearest table. His legs moved before his mind could catch up. Each step he took toward her pulled him deeper into a storm he had spent years avoiding. The Rosners parted like waves, some out of shock, others out of discomfort. His mother clutched her pearls. His grandfather sat back, expression unreadable. No one reached for him. No one stopped him either. When Dylan reached April, she took his hand without hesitation. It was small in his, like it had always been, but warmer than he remembered. She leaned close, whispering just enough for only him to hear. "I'm sorry for not inviting you. I wasn't strong enough. Until today." He didn't answer. He just squeezed her hand, nodded once, and turned toward the aisle. Together. They stepped forward. The music resumed, but it was different now, softer, almost reverent. A hush fell over the room. Guests stood still as Dylan walked her past them. Every pair of eyes followed, some full of awe, others of judgment. But Dylan didn't look away. He held his head high, not in defiance but in quiet pride. To the left, he saw his uncle staring blankly, wine glass frozen in midair. To the right, a distant cousin that shook her head, whispering something to her husband. But just beyond them, Dylan caught the glint of a phone Micah again, this time recording silently, capturing the moment. He didn't mind. Not anymore. At the altar, the groom stepped forward, eyes wide, but not with anger. It was surprise and something else, gratitude. He reached for April's hand and nodded respectfully at Dylan. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The officiant stuttered briefly, then cleared his throat and carried on. Dylan stepped aside, taking in a spot near the front but not too close. He stood with hands clasped before him. The uniform still creased, his name tag still in place. He didn't belong to this seating chart, but he belonged to this moment. As the vows began, Dylan felt the weight of years lifting bit by bit. For so long, he had believed he was forgotten, but April hadn't forgotten. Not the laughter, not the lullabies, not the nights when he tucked her in like a brother would. He watched her speak her promises, eyes glistening, voice steady. And when the officiant pronounced them married, the crowd applauded, some warmly, others mechanically. But for Dylan, it wasn't about their approval. It was about the way April turned first to him before anyone else. She mouthed, "Thank you." Then she stepped forward and pulled him into a hug so tight it silenced the room all over again. It wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was more than he thought he'd ever get. And then came the chaos. As the guests moved toward the reception area, Dylan returned briefly to the kitchen, unsure of what came next. Should he stay? Should he leave now? Before someone ruined the moment, but before he could decide, Micah found him. "You need to see this," he said, holding up his phone. A clip had already made its way online, just a few seconds long, but it was enough. April calling out Dylan's name, him walking her down the aisle, the stunned silence of the crowd. It was going viral. Comments flooded in, "This is what bravery looks like. Not all heroes wear tuxedos." He served their tables, then he showed them how to stand tall. Dylan stared at the screen in disbelief. "This is your story now," Micah said. "People need to hear it." But Dylan shook his head. "It's not about me," he replied. Micah smiled. "That's exactly why it should be." What Dylan didn't know yet, what he would only find out days later, was that someone else had seen the video. Someone who hadn't spoken his name in years. Someone who had once loved music, too, before fear silenced his heart. And that man was already writing a letter. One that would change everything Dylan thought he knew about the past. The wedding ended under soft lights and a sky beginning to turn dark blue. As guests filtered out with their goodie bags and unfinished drinks, Dylan remained in the back corridor of the hotel, seated on a folding chair beside a rack of used champagne flutes. His legs were tired, but his heart was restless. Everything should have ended there. He had done what April asked. He had stood tall in front of those who once erased him. He had even smiled through it. And yet, something inside him couldn't settle. Not because of what had happened, but because of what might follow. Would they reach out now? Would the Rosners try to claim him again out of guilt, out of public pressure, out of damage control? Would it all be a performance? He didn't want their pity. And then, as if answering the question before it could finish forming, the front desk called for him. "Someone dropped this off for you," the concierge said, handing him an envelope. There was no return address, no name, just the words for Dylan. "After the wedding," written in ink that shook slightly, as if from an old man's hand. His fingers trembled as he opened it. Inside was a folded letter in something small, wrapped in cloth. He unfolded the page. "Dylan, if this finds you, it means you came. It means you showed up even when no one gave you reason to. That's something I never could do. You see, I recognized something in you a long time ago. Not the boy you were, but the man you were becoming. I saw pieces of myself, and that terrified me. I wasn't strong like you. I folded. I let their voices drown mine out. I once loved someone, too. A boy named Robert. We used to play piano together in the church basement. That was our secret, our sanctuary. But when the rumors started, I chose the side that hurt less publicly. I married. I had children. I built a name. And I buried him in silence. He died before I ever told him I was sorry. Watching you grow, your confidence, your fire, your refusal to become bitter, I didn't know how to face that. So I chose distance again. I chose to erase you so I wouldn't have to face the coward I became. But you brought April into that room like you carried your own past. You didn't hide, and that broke something in me. Maybe something that needed to break. I don't know if you can forgive me. I don't know if you even want to. But inside this cloth is something I never gave anyone else. It belonged to Robert. He gave it to me before we parted. I couldn't wear it. But maybe you can. Maybe it's time." The letter ended without a signature. But Dylan didn't need one. He knew the handwriting. His grandfather. Slowly, he unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a ring. Simple. Silver. Worn with age but polished with care. Inside the band was an engraving barely visible under the years where music begins. "Love remembers." Dylan sat still for a long time. Memories returned like soft echoes, his grandfather teaching him chords on the piano, correcting his posture, watching silently from the hallway, the way his eyes lingered when Dylan played something heartfelt. He thought it was pride. Maybe it had been something else. Maybe it was memory. He didn't know what to do with the letter or the ring. Not yet. Part of him still ached. Part of him wanted to scream. But another part, a quieter one, felt something unexpected. Understanding. Not acceptance. Not justification. But a thread of human truth that hurt more than hate did. The next day, Dylan didn't return to his shift. Instead, he took the train to the edge of the city and walked to the nursing home where his grandfather lived. He didn't make an appointment. He didn't bring flowers. He simply waited at the entrance until someone led him through a hallway that smelled of lemon polish and forgetfulness. The old man was seated by the window, hands folded, eyes on the bird feeder outside. He didn't turn when Dylan entered. Dylan stood there, the envelope in one pocket, the ring in the other. He looked at the man who had once cut him out of every photograph, who had spoken louder than the rest when silence was no longer enough. And he saw now not a monster but a man built from fear, locked in a prison of his own history. Still, he said nothing. Instead, Dylan walked to the piano in the corner of the room. He sat. He placed his fingers on the keys, and he began to play. Not the dramatic pieces he once practiced for recitals, not the perfect scales he had mastered in adolescence, but a lullaby, the one he had taught April during storms, the one she had whispered she remembered, even after all these years. As he played, a nurse stopped in the doorway. A resident sat up a little straighter, and the old man by the window turned slowly, his eyes wet, his mouth open just slightly, as if words had escaped him a long time ago. He said nothing, but Dylan kept playing, Because sometimes reconciliation isn't loud. Sometimes it isn't about apologies or explanations. Sometimes it's a song in a quiet room, a broken ring passed on, a silence finally filled. And sometimes that's enough. Weeks passed. The video of Dylan walking April down the aisle continued to spread. Media outlets began reaching out. Advocacy groups mentioned his name in articles about chosen family. Messages flooded in from strangers, some who had never come out, some who had been cut off by loved ones, some who simply wrote to say, "You made me feel seen." Dylan didn't reply to many. He read them, slowly, sometimes twice, letting each word soak into parts of him that had long gone numb. But he didn't return it to the hotel, not even once. Instead, he stayed close to the nursing home, not because anyone asked him to, but because the piano was there. Because each afternoon, as sun poured through the windows and cast long shadows across the tiled floor, his grandfather would sit quietly while Dylan played. They rarely spoke, but the silence had changed. It no longer felt like avoidance, it felt like presence. One day, without warning, his grandfather pushed a folded piece of paper across the table during lunch. "Your father wanted you to have the house." He didn't say it out loud, but I found the paperwork he never filed. I've signed what he couldn't. Attached was the deed. It was the old Rosner house where Dylan had grown up. The same house that once held laughter and arguments and music behind closed doors. The one where his name had been scrubbed off every surface. Dylan stared at the paper, then looked up. Why now his grandfather didn't blink? Because legacies don't have to be curses. That evening, Dylan walked through the empty house for the first time in years. It still smelled faintly of cedar and old books. He found the spot on the wall where his growth chart had once been marked in pencil. The lines were gone, painted over, but he remembered each number. He touched the wood with the tips of his fingers, as if to summon them back. In the attic, he uncovered boxes that hadn't been touched in over a decade. Among them was a dusty scrapbook April's, with photos of her and Dylan taped unevenly beside glitter stickers and misspelled captions. One picture showed the two of them sitting on the old piano bench, her legs swinging, his mouth open mid-laugh. Below it she had written, "My best friend who makes storms go away." He closed the book and cried for the boy in the photo, for the years lost, for the music that had almost disappeared. But the next morning, Dylan woke up with clarity. He wouldn't just reclaim the house, he would transform it. Months later, the doors of Rosner and April opened quietly but confidently on a Sunday morning. The old house had been repainted, the inside reimagined as a community art space and tea room, a place for the ones left out of family portraits. There were bookshelves lined with queer authors. Paintings by local artists hung beside Polaroids of laughing strangers. The piano sat in the corner, polished and waiting. At the entrance, under soft lighting, hung a framed quote, "Family is not who you're born to. It's who holds the silence with you until you can sing again." April April visited often and sometimes bringing leftover cake from her own bakery. She told every guest the story of her wedding day, not the flowers, not the first dance, but the moment her cousin in a waiter's uniform saved it all. Micah helped set up a small recording booth in the back for those who wanted to share their own stories. Dylan didn't sit in it, not yet, but he listened. And each story added another key to the song he was learning to play, not just on the piano, but in his own life. Then, one afternoon, a boy walked in. 16, maybe 17, quiet, nervous. He didn't order tea, he didn't ask to see the art. He just stood near the piano and said, "My uncle stopped talking to me after I came out. He used to play guitar with me. Now he won't return my calls. I thought maybe coming here would feel less alone." Dylan didn't ask his name. He just pulled the bench back and said, "You know any songs?" The boy nodded, sat beside him, and began to play. No words, just music. And for the first time in years, Dylan didn't feel like he had something to prove. He had already done the hardest part, stayed. Not just alive, but soft, but open, but brave. Because that's the story the world rarely tells: what happens after the hug, after the redemption, after the viral moment. The story of building something new in the quiet, of forgiving just enough to live, not to forget, not to erase, but to move forward, not as a waiter, not as an outcast, but as someone who made space where there once was none. If this story touched you, tell me this. What would you say to someone who once erased you if they finally listened? Leave your answer in the comments. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe to Heart Stories. Because every time someone speaks their truth, it helps another person feel just a little less invisible.